Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, an update on PFAS in Massachusetts and across the U.S. I'm Dr. Michael Mislak, medical advisor for the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, and I'd like to thank you all for joining today. The MBCC is dedicated to preventing environmental causes of breast cancer through community education, research, advocacy, and changes to public policy. I'm pleased to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Laurel Schaider. Dr. Laurel Schaider is a senior scientist at Silent Spring Institute, where she leads the Institute's water quality research on PFAS and other contaminants of emerging concern. She studies PFAS chemicals in drinking water, consumer products, and food, drinking water contamination from septic systems, and environmental justice disparities in drinking water quality. Dr. Schaider, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to figure out how to share my screen here. Shane, is there a link? Oh, there we go. Perfect. All right. You seeing my slides?
Yes, we are.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. It's always a pleasure to talk with all of you at MBCC about our research on PFAS, and always a pleasure as well to collaborate with Cheryl Osimo and Shane and Jared and the other members of the team from MBCC on our federally funded PFAS research. So for today, I will be sharing some updates about what's going on with PFAS here in Massachusetts and provide some updates across the US. I think about PFAS all day long, and there are so many different aspects to this to share updates about. So I hope you find today's update informative, and happy to answer any questions that you have at the end. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Silent Spring Institute, but for those of you who may be new to Silent Spring, we're an independent nonprofit research organization dedicated to understanding links between everyday chemicals and women's health, with a particular focus on breast cancer prevention. We were founded 30 years ago by visionary activists from Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, who recognized the need for more research on environmental causes of breast cancer, calling us a lab of our own. Silent Spring has emerged over the past 30 years, developed into a leading scientific research organization on environmental causes of breast cancer. We continue to work really closely with MBCC and with other advocacy organizations to help elevate and translate our work into meaningful public health change. So for today's presentation, I will provide an overview of PFAS exposures and health effects. For those of you who've attended these webinars previously, this may be a bit of a review, but for those of you who are newer to PFAS or don't think about them all the time, it will provide an overview of what these chemicals are, how we can be exposed, and why that's concerning in terms of health effects. I'll provide a few updates about recent regulations and policies that have come into effect over the past year. And I'd like to tell you about two of the studies that we currently have underway related to PFAS here in Massachusetts. And I always like to end with some next steps and things that all of you can do. So starting with a primer on what are PFAS, how we can be exposed, and what are the health effects. So PFAS is not one thing. It's an umbrella term for a broad family of 14,000 different chemical compounds. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which is a mouthful, which is why they've also been dubbed forever chemicals, since it's easier to say, and it reflects the fact that PFAS chemicals are extremely resistant to degradation. PFAS are mobile in the environment. They've been found in every corner of the globe, in ocean water, in the blood of people who live near the Arctic, in polar bears, and in pretty much every person in the US whose blood has been tested. PFAS are widely used in consumer products and have been since the 1950s. But it's just been in the past 10 to 15 years when they've really gotten so much heightened scrutiny and concern among regulators and activists and scientists. That's been due in part to the effective advocacy of many organizations to raise the awareness of how widespread this issue is, And it's also been due to the fact that there are new analytical techniques that allow us to measure parts per trillion levels of PFAS in drinking water, which has provided this new lens and revealed that PFAS are very widespread in drinking water all across the country. If you haven't yet watched the films Dark Waters or The Devil We Know, these are good introductions to PFAS chemistry and also to a community in West Virginia where PFAS contamination was caused by a DuPont plant and the heroic efforts of a lawyer, Rob Bilott, to bring justice for the community. So I would recommend those if you haven't watched them before. So if you look at product labels, you usually don't see PFAS on the product label, but they are found in many of the products that we use in our everyday lives. So if you think of Gore-Tex, Scotchgard, Stainmaster, or Teflon, these are chemicals that are used in non-stick, stain-resistant, waterproof, and grease-resistant products. They show up in a lot of places where you might not expect to find them as well. For instance, Oral-B Glide dental floss, microwave popcorn bags, waterproof mascara, paints, all kinds of everyday uses. So it can be very challenging even for someone like me who studies PFAS to know how to avoid PFAS in our daily lives. I am not going to do a deep dive on PFAS chemistry, but I did want to introduce a couple of terms and introduce you to some of the different types of PFAS because it is important for understanding how we're getting exposed and what the patterns of exposure are, how they're changing over time. So I'll talk in a few minutes about the PFAS that are currently being regulated in drinking water here in the US. So PFOS, PFOA are two examples of commonly found PFAS in drinking water and in people's blood samples. And these are what we call long chain PFAS, and that's because they have a long carbon backbone. So these little green circles in the middle of the chemical structure are carbons. So it has a long carbon chain, and then it has many carbon-fluorine bonds. And those carbon-fluorine bonds are some of the strongest bonds in the organic chemistry world. And so that is why these chemicals are virtually indestructible under normal conditions, because those bonds are so strong. Many PFAS chemicals have been phased out of production in the US and in Europe. And fortunately, exposures and blood levels of these long-chain PFAS are going down. These are the PFAS that have the most extensive evidence for harmful health effects. And they're of particular concern because they have what we call long human half-lives. So it means that they stay in our blood for many years, even after we stop being exposed to them. So it takes years for the amount of PFAS to go down in your blood by half, and then that same amount of time to go down to a quarter. Because of the concerns about health effects and that long half-life in the body, manufacturers have switched from producing long-chain PFAS to other PFAS. Some of these are what we call short-chain PFAS. So they look a lot like PFAS or PFOA. They just have a shorter carbon chain. So for instance, in the lower left corner here, this is PFHXA, and it's the 6-carbon shorter cousin of PFOA. And then there are other variations on the chemistry as well. So this is a chemical here on the right called Gen X, which looks very similar to the long chain PFAS or the other PFAS, but it has an oxygen here in the middle of the carbon chain. And so it's a slightly different kind of chemical that we call perfluoroether. And then another branch of the PFAS tree are what we call polymers. So polymers are large molecules that are built on repeating building blocks. So for instance, this is Teflon here on the right, which basically is a very long carbon chain that's just totally surrounded by fluorine atoms. Industry would like us to believe that these polymers are inert because the polymers themselves are very large molecules and they're difficult for to be absorbed into our cells. However, it's in terms of how we get exposed and the life cycle of PFAS, we really can't think of polymers separately from these other non-polymer chemicals that are here on the left side of the screen, because we never have just one PFAS at a time. The polymers are manufactured from stitching together many of these smaller repeating molecules, and there are other PFAS that can be present as impurities or used as processing aids. We also need to think about the whole life cycle of PFAS and what happens near where polymers are manufactured and ultimately where they end up in the environment. So as I mentioned, there are really widespread concerns about PFAS in drinking water, and there are a growing number of sources that we're recognizing that can lead to PFAS contamination. In the communities where we see the highest levels of contamination, the most common sources are a class of firefighting foam called AFFF or Class B. These firefighting foams are frequently used at military bases, airports, and other fire training academies for putting out liquid fuel fires. The highest levels of PFAS have also been found near fluoropolymer production facilities. So for instance, DuPont or 3M plants where Teflon and other polymers have been manufactured, as well as other industrial facilities. For instance, the St. Gobain plant in Merrimack where Teflon coated products were manufactured. We also are seeing a growing number of locations in the environment where PFAS are coming from our waste stream, which can include discharges from wastewater treatment plants and septic systems, leachate from landfills, and land-applied biosolids. In general, the levels of contamination are lower from these waste-related sources, but they're far more prevalent. So we know that PFAS are manufactured, so these are all synthetic compounds, so they all come from an industrial source, and they can get out into the environment through our waste infrastructure, through AFFF, firefighting foams, and then we can be exposed in a few different ways. We can be exposed from the products that we're using directly. There can be absorption of PFAS potentially across our skin. We can breathe in the PFAS. We can ingest them either from our hands or from, if you're a child and you're crawling around a lot on the floor, they put their hands in their mouth a lot. PFAS can also be in indoor air and dust. So the products that we have in our homes, the building materials can directly expose us. We can also be exposed through drinking water, as I've mentioned, and also through food. So the plants and animals that we eat can absorb PFAS from their surroundings, or PFAS can bioaccumulate up the food chain, and PFAS are also found in certain types of food packaging. So I often get the question of, well, so what's actually the largest source of exposure to PFAS among people? And the answer is that it depends on a number of factors. There's no one answer that is the same for every person, for every community, for every PFAS, and over time. And the way that it helps me think about it is to think about the amount of PFAS that we're taking into our bodies as a pie chart with kind of three main slices. So we can be exposed to PFAS from drinking water, we can be exposed to PFAS from food and food packaging, and then consumer products. And then everyone also has a different size pie depending on how much PFAS we're taking in from all these different sources. In a contaminated community where the drinking water is contaminated, it's likely that for residents in those communities, that drinking water really is their largest source of exposure. So their pie chart would have a large blue slice representing the dominance of drinking water as the exposure source. But that can change over time. After a water supply discovers a PFAS contamination issue, typically there's filtration or some other remediation plan put in place to take the PFAS out of the drinking water. And so over time, the slice of the pie for drinking water in terms of future exposures will get smaller. In the general population, in areas where drinking water is not highly contaminated, it's thought that food is actually the largest source of exposure. Often fish and shellfish seem to be the most consistent sources of dietary exposure, but PFAS can also come from dairy, eggs, soy, and a number of other types of foods as well. In some of our past work, we've also seen, for instance, that microwave popcorn seems to be a source of exposure, and that's related to the grease-proof coating added to microwave popcorn bags. And then there are also consumer product exposures as well, and those I would say are probably less well characterized because there are many different types of products in our home that can contain PFAS. So in terms of how the relative contributions might change over time, in addition to depending on the status of water contamination and filtration, it also depends on the type of PFAS. So I mentioned that the long chain PFAS have been phased out of production in the US. So in general, we would expect that food packaging and consumer products really shouldn't be primary sources of long chain PFAS exposure anymore. But these might be important sources of short chain or other current use PFAS. So we also have to think about product reformulation and shifts in what is being added to products. The encouraging news is that we know that when we reduce exposures to PFAS by taking them out of products, that does mean that people's exposures can go down as well. So this graph is showing testing conducted by the CDC. This is a program called NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And they've been testing PFAS in a representative sampling of several thousand people in the US every 2 to 4 years over time. going back to 1999. And their testing shows that for chemicals like PFAS, which are no longer manufactured in the US, that levels in the general population are going down. So that is good news. What we don't have a good handle on is the level of exposure to short chain PFAS, which are the ones and other current use PFAS. These tend not to be detected in blood as readily as the long chain PFAS, but it doesn't mean that exposures aren't occurring. All of this is concerning because exposures to PFAS have been associated with a wide range of many different types of harmful health effects. These range from increased cholesterol, suppression of our immune system, particularly decreased antibody response in kids after routine vaccinations. PFAS can affect thyroid, liver, kidney function. They can cause developmental changes, for instance, decreases in birth weight or changes in bone density, and certain types of cancer. Most of the information or much of the research on health effects has focused on long chain PFAS, such as PFAS and PFOA, but there is growing evidence that the current use PFAS do raise many of the same health concerns. Specifically related to breast cancer, there are some reasons why we're concerned about potential links between PFAS exposures and breast cancer. Studies about 10 or so years ago on PFAS, specifically PFOA, in rodents has shown that in laboratory studies that PFOA can impair mammary gland development. And for us, that's a red flag, like a warning sign that these are chemicals that could play a role in breast cancer. In communities with elevated PFAS exposures, there's some evidence from epidemiological studies of shorter duration of breastfeeding. That is consistent with the idea that PFAS may be affecting mammary gland development in people as well, but I think there's more research needed to really explore that connection. Last year, IARC, which is the International Association on Research on Cancer, classified PFOA specifically as carcinogenic to humans and PFOS as possibly carcinogenic. Just a couple of months ago, a new systematic review came out that I'm still diving into to really completely understand, but the review put together information from a number of other epidemiological studies and found that overall there was inadequate evidence of a link between PFAS exposures and breast cancer. However, they did find that when they in studies that specifically measured PFOA levels in women's blood before their breast cancer diagnosis, they did find some evidence to suggest that there was a link there. And they also found some evidence that associations may depend on the type of breast cancer tumor and also on menopausal status. I did also want to mention that in 2022, the National Academies had a study panel that issued a report that provided guidance for clinicians about how to respond to PFAS exposures among their patients. And as part of that work, the study panel did an extensive review of existing toxicological and epidemiological evidence on PFAS harmful health effects. And as a result of their analysis, they found moderate confidence that there is an association between PFAS exposures and increased risk of breast cancer, although they gave it limited or suggested evidence of an association because they couldn't rule out that the associations were due to chance or bias. And as part of the National Academies report, they created guidance for clinicians and certain types of screenings to consider for people who had elevated exposures. And they did mention breast cancer in their guidance. So that's a very quick overview of what PFAS are, how we can be exposed, and what are the concerns about health effects. So I wanted to spend a few minutes now to talk about new regulations and policies that have come into effect since the last time that I provided an update late last year. So last year when I gave an update to MBCC about PFAS in drinking water, EPA had issued draft drinking water standards that were still out for comment and being in the process of being revised. And in April of this year, the EPA for the first time finalized the first national drinking water standards. For those of you who are here in Massachusetts, you may remember that in 2020, our state actually instigated PFAS drinking water standards for 6 PFAS chemicals, which they called PFAS 6, and they set the level at 20 parts per trillion. So that means that for public water supplies here in Massachusetts, they already had to have started doing testing for PFAS, and for water systems that exceeded that standard, they had to take steps to come into compliance. And a number of other states also had put into place their own standards while they were waiting for EPA to take action. But in other states, there have not been any standards or guidelines put into place. And in those states, water supplies will be testing for PFAS really for the first time. There's going to be a big challenge for many communities to come into compliance with these new standards. So just to tell you a little bit more about the standards, so EPA set a limit on 6 PFAS chemicals. 4 of them are included in the PFAS 6 that are regulated here in Massachusetts, and then there are 2 other PFAS chemicals as well. I won't spend too long talking about the details of these. I'm sharing a link to the PFAS exchange where we have a little bit more detailed primer for those of you who want to learn more about the exact levels for these standards. But in short, PFOA and PFAS are now being regulated at 4 parts per trillion individually. 3 other PFAS chemicals, so 2 long chain chemicals and one of the current use chemicals, Gen X, are regulated at 10 parts per trillion. And then EPA also developed a hazard index, which is a way of grouping multiple chemicals into a single standard relative to health-based reference levels. And that was an encouraging addition from the EPA that I think paves a path forward for how we might be able to think about including regulations for other PFAS chemicals as well. And I just wanted to reflect as well, I started working on PFAS 15 years ago. At that time, there was far less attention and news coverage of PFAS. We had far less understanding of just how prevalent and widespread these chemicals are. At that time, the EPA had non-enforceable guideline values just for PFAS and PFOA. At that time, the level was 400 parts per trillion for PFOA and 200 for PFOS. And so now those levels have gone down almost by an order of 50 to 100 down to 4 parts per trillion. And this reflects the fact that emerging science has shown us that these chemicals are toxic at lower levels than we previously understood. I also wanted to note that in April of this year, EPA also added PFAS and PFOA as hazardous substances under CERCLA, which is the Superfund law. So this is the first time that under federal law that PFAS were deemed hazardous substances under CERCLA. And what this means is that EPA has authority to streamline cleanup of Superfund sites where PFAS are a contamination, and that they can hold polluting parties responsible for contributing to the cleanup. There is some discretion in terms of the types of polluting parties that would be considered responsible. For instance, municipal drinking water or wastewater treatment plants, local fire departments, municipally owned airports would likely not be subject to the same type of enforcement in terms of being deemed a polluting party. So this is a big step forward in addressing contaminated sites. I also wanted to mention that earlier this year as well, the Food and Drug Administration, this is the agency that regulates the types of additives to food and to food packaging, announced that certain short chain PFAS were no longer going to be allowed in food packaging. I'm still trying to read between the lines of the rule. Some of the wording makes it sound like there are no PFAS that are allowed in food packaging any longer. But some of the wording said that there was restrictions on certain types of PFAS. And in any case, there will be a period of time for the phasing out of the current stock of food packaging that's already been produced containing PFAS. So this is really good news because we do think PFAS in food packaging is an important source of exposure. And I think it's important to make sure that, that there aren't still other types of PFAS that are still being added. Here in Massachusetts, for those of you who've been following state regulations or keeping up with MBCC, you may know that in the last legislative cycle, there were 2 bills that were being considered that would have really restricted PFAS here in Massachusetts. One of the bills was the Massachusetts PFAS Act, which would have limited PFAS in many everyday consumer items, as well as providing funding for communities to address PFAS contamination, to provide education and to support disadvantaged communities, and a second bill on toxics in products for children, which would have addressed PFAS and other toxic chemicals as well. So those bills did not get passed in the last legislative cycle. The PFAS, the broad PFAS bill, a portion of that did get passed, which banned PFAS in firefighter gear. So that did get signed at the end of the last legislative cycle. This would require labeling of PFAS in firefighter gear by January of 2025 and banning the sale by January of 2027. So I do think that's an important first step. There are definitely concerns about exposures to PFAS among firefighters. And I would encourage all of you who are interested here in Massachusetts to follow the MBCC website and the status of these bills in the next legislative cycle. So now I'd like to tell you about 2 studies that we currently have underway related to PFAS here in Massachusetts. And for both of these studies, we're pleased to be partnering with Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition as an important community partner to support our work here in the state. PFAS continue to make headlines every day in the news related to the drinking water standards that were put into place in April. Certainly there are concerns about how communities will be able to afford to pay for the testing and the treatment to come into compliance. I mentioned earlier that waste sources can be a source of contamination as well. For instance, in Westminster, there has been private well water contamination related to land applied biosolids or sludge, and throughout the state, every corner of the state, even out to Nantucket, are concerns about PFAS in both public and private drinking water supplies. So while there's a lot that we know about how PFAS can affect our health, there's still a lot that we don't know, particularly how different mixtures of PFAS chemicals and the different levels of exposure might affect our health. And so to address some of the gaps that we have in our understanding of how PFAS can affect our health, there's a major epidemiological study currently underway. It's funded by the CDC and by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, or ATSDR. The overall goal is to improve our understanding of PFAS-related health effects. Back in 2019, Silent Spring Institute applied to be part of this multi-site study. And we were successfully funded as one of 7 research teams that are working with local communities that have had a history of PFAS water contamination. So our study is called the Massachusetts PFAS in Your Health study. We are conducting this work in partnership with 2 communities. So Hyannis on Cape Cod, where firefighting foam led to contamination of the public drinking water wells in Hyannis at levels higher than any other water supply in Massachusetts. We're also working with the town of Air, which is west of Boston, where there was contamination thought to be linked to firefighting foams used at the former Fort Devens site. Fortunately, in both communities, all of the public wells are being filtered to remove PFAS, so that's really important to note that those exposures are not ongoing, but there are still things that we can learn from the past exposures. So we're working with other researchers from Harvard School of Public Health and the Eastern Research Group, and we're partnering with Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, particularly Cheryl Osimo and her team on the Cape, who were instrumental in helping us recruit and enroll people into our study. And in AIR, we worked with the group called People of AIR Concerned About the Environment, or PACE. So just a quick timeline. So we were initially awarded the grant to be part of this multi-site study in 2019. COVID definitely had an impact on the timeline for the study. So it took about 2 years for the approval and all the study protocols to be finalized. We launched enrollment in Hyannis in November of 2021, and a year later launched our enrollment in AIR. We continued to recruit in both communities through the end of last September, when all 7 sites stopped recruiting and collecting new data, and we are now in the process of analyzing all those results. This past June, we had community meetings in both of our communities to share initial findings based on the PFAS blood testing results. So I wanted to share some of those initial findings with all of you right now. Just to say a little bit more about the study itself. So we actively recruited participants who potentially lived in air in Hyannis when the water was contaminated, or potentially could have had exposures from the drinking water when the water was contaminated. We had a very active recruitment strategy with postcards. We had informational tables at grocery stores, at community events. We did door-to-door canvassing in Hyannis. We had social media. We reached out to local journalists, really trying to meet people wherever they were in the communities. People had to have lived in Hyannis or air prior to the installation of water treatment, because we were looking to recruit people who could have been exposed to the water when it was still contained elevated PFAS. Participants came to our local clinic. We have a temporary clinic in both Hyannis and air. They completed a blood draw and body measurements, things like height, weight, and blood pressure. They completed a questionnaire about where they live, worked, their medical history, and about their water consumption. And children completed a series of neurobehavioral tests as well. And those were the same protocols that were conducted by all the other research teams in the other states, with the goal being that the results from all that testing will be combined, can be combined because they were collected in the same way. For our participants in Massachusetts, we also collected some additional information about diet and consumer product use, COVID status, and we collected additional blood samples that will allow us to do additional testing. So as I said, we held community update meetings in June to share information with our participants. Throughout the process of the study, when we had results of PFAS results for our individual participants, we did send them individual letters, but this was the first time that we sort of shared at a community level what we had learned about exposure levels. Across our 2 communities, we recruited 676 adults and 89 children who completed blood draws and questionnaires. And we had about similar numbers of children across the 2 communities and slightly more adults in Hyannis than air. So I'm going to walk you through some of our overall findings related to blood levels. Don't worry, this table has a lot of numbers, but I will walk you through it to show some of our kind of high-level findings. All blood samples from all of our participants, both adults and children, were tested for 7 long-chain PFAS. For today, I'm just going to share about adult blood levels. The concentrations or the levels of PFAS I'm presenting on are in parts per billion, which is micrograms per liter, or nanograms per milliliter, and all equivalent concentration units. Of the 7 chemicals, 4 of them were found in nearly all of our participants. And you might note that these 4 are 4 of the PFAS that EPA is also regulating in drinking water. So it's not unexpected that we would find these chemicals in all of our participants, because CDC tends to find these chemicals pretty commonly in people in the general population. In particular, PFOS and PFHXS were present at the highest concentrations in the blood samples. And these 2 chemicals in particular are the ones that are most typically elevated in communities with a history of firefighting foam contamination. I did also want to note that the median levels in Hyannis were higher than those in air, and that's consistent with what we know about the level of contamination. The PFAS levels in Hyannis used to be much higher than those in air. So it's not unexpected that the blood levels are still higher as well. So I also you might wonder how the levels compare to the general population. So what this graph is showing is for these 4 most frequently found PFAS, the median level in Hyannis, shown in blue, in air, shown in orange, and in gray for the general population. Because PFAS tend to accumulate in our bodies over time, in general, older adults have higher levels of PFAS than younger adults. In our study population, we tended to have a higher median age among our participants than the general population. So even without any water contamination, if we made just a simple comparison of our results from our study communities and the general population, we would expect to see our communities at higher levels because our participants were older. So to account for that, we adjusted that we did a statistical analysis. I won't get into the details of it, basically to say, well, what would the median level have been in Hyannis and air if the age distribution was the same as the general population? And that allowed us to say, okay, if we're seeing a difference between Hyannis and air and the general population, that's not due to the age distribution, but it's likely related to the drinking water. So on this graph, I just wanted to pull your attention to PFHXS. This is the PFAS that tends to be most elevated in communities with a history of firefighting foam contamination. And here we did see that Hyannis was over 3 times higher than the general population. And in air, the levels were not as highly elevated, but we did see that the levels were higher than the general population. I'll also note that the gray bar here for the general population, those samples were collected about 4 or 5 years before the study started. And if you remember that graph, in the general population, the levels of these chemicals are going down. So I think in reality, if we had measurements for the general population at the same time, this gray bar would be a bit lower. And so the difference between our communities and the general population might be a little bit greater. Consistent with other studies, we did see that older participants had higher levels than younger adults. We saw that adults had higher levels than children, which is also not unexpected. And similar to other studies, we also found that men on average had higher levels than women. And this is consistent with what we know about PFAS in our bodies. PFAS do tend to bind to proteins in our blood. And so women can have lower levels of PFAS in their bodies because they lose PFAS from menstruation. Unfortunately, women also pass along PFAS during pregnancy and breastfeeding. So those PFAS get passed along to infants who are most vulnerable. That also means that women's levels in their blood tend to be somewhat lower because some of that PFAS gets passed along. So in terms of next steps for our study, we are working tirelessly with our partners at ATSDR and the other sites to analyze the data. We're in the process of looking for associations between PFAS levels in people's blood and health effects. The results from Hyannis and air are being combined with the data from communities in the other 6 states. So for some of the health effects, for instance, hypertension and metabolic syndrome, researchers from our team are leading the analysis of using data from all of the sites. And for some of the other types of health effects, for instance, thyroid, hormone effects, diabetes, other health outcomes, our Massachusetts participant data is being combined, and those analyses are being led by researchers from other sites. We have collected additional samples for our Massachusetts participants. And so we also will be learning more about different types of PFAS, just beyond just the 7 that were included in the CDC testing. We're looking at links between self-reported diet and consumer products. So we can kind of think about that pie chart and try to get a better understanding of, in these communities where the water has been treated for a number of years, how much of the exposure moving forward is still coming from water and how much is coming from diet and consumer products. We are actively working to reconstruct past levels of PFAS in drinking water in both of our communities and looking to evaluate cumulative exposures among our participants, because PFAS cause chronic health effects, and by looking at blood levels, that's just a one-time snapshot of people's exposures. But if we go back in time, estimate what the PFAS levels used to be in the water and look at people's residential history, that will give us a sense of who really had higher exposures over their lifetime, and use that information to refine our understanding of health effects. And we will continue to provide updates to our core communities over time, and here with MBCC as well. So a lot of our work and a lot of the research right now is focused really heavily on drinking water, but there's growing recognition that fish, shellfish, and other local food sources can also be sources of PFAS exposure. And this is particularly concerning for subsistence fishers and tribal members who may have elevated exposures because of their reliance and higher rates of consumption of local fish, shellfish, and game. An environmental working group study in 2023 found that PFAS are common in freshwater fish across the country. So I wanted to tell you about another one of our research studies currently underway here in Massachusetts called STEEP, which is the Superfund research program led by University of Rhode Island, together with other researchers from Harvard and Silent Spring Institute. STEEP has a lot of different components to it, including research studies on PFAS health effects, environmental transport, and chemical properties. There are also community engagement and research translation components as well. So I co-lead the community engagement core for STEEP, together with another researcher at University of Rhode Island. And a lot of our work is focused on Cape Cod, and we're proud to be partnering with Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition as one of our core community partners for STEEP, as well as the Sierra Club Cape Cod group, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, and our Cape Cod advisory group. So our community engagement core is working with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe to understand exposures from local fish, shellfish, and well water consumption, and recognizing the unique role that fish and shellfish play among tribal members, and thinking about how we can translate our research findings in ways that are culturally appropriate. We've been working with grad students and postdocs from URI and Harvard to conduct high school education activities on the Cape to talk about PFAS and other water quality concerns. We aim to offer testing for PFAS in homegrown produce and locally caught fish in Hyannis, to think about the other exposure pathways that may still be elevated in this area where the water is now being treated, and to collaborate with community organizations on the Cape, and more broadly to think about ways to engage with the community on PFAS. As part of the STEEP study, one of the researchers from Harvard University, Dr. Heidi Picard, conducted analyses of fish and shellfish samples collected on the Upper Cape. These samples were collected in partnership with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and with the town of Mashpee. And in general, the results of this testing showed that shellfish tended to have lower levels of PFAS than finfish. And the results also showed that there were higher levels in fish and shellfish collected closer to Joint Base Cape Cod, where PFAS containing firefighting foams were used for training activities over the years. So on the right here is a public-facing two-page overview of these findings. You can find them on the STEEP website as well. We also held an event in May where we showed we had a screening of the film, The Poison in Us All. We had a panel discussion, and Heidi came down to the Cape to share an update about the results of her testing. We've also shared updates in the past about our private well water testing program. We collected and analyzed well water samples from 65 private wells on Cape Cod as part of a second round of our private well water testing program. In general, we found that wells with higher levels of nitrate tended to have higher levels of PFAS, and that's consistent with what we know about where PFAS might be coming from on the Cape. Most residents of Cape Cod have a septic system, which means that there are many places in the groundwater aquifer where wastewater can be getting into the ground. And we know that PFAS can be found in wastewater. And so we think that that correlation suggests that septic systems could be an important source of PFAS into private wells in the Cape. Fortunately, we saw that the vast majority of wells did not exceed the state drinking water standard. And we're in the process of doing some actual additional testing for a few of the wells that had higher levels, and evaluating the ability of home water treatment systems to remove PFAS. And that's in collaboration with Elsie Sunderland at Harvard and one of her researchers. So I kind of wanted to wrap up here thinking a little bit about environmental justice and what are the implications of PFAS water testing, and who's at greatest risk of PFAS exposures. And PFAS water contamination in particular does pose unique challenges for vulnerable communities. I wanted to note that testing for PFAS is expensive, so it's hundreds of dollars just to get a single water sample tested for PFAS. And for water systems that have to put in place treatment, it can be hugely expensive. So just thinking about Hyannis, which is a fairly small water system with 14,000 customers, they've spent over $20 million to address PFAS there. It can be challenging to identify where PFAS are coming from, because in some cases, because the chemicals are so persistent, they could have come from a company or from an emergency response site that hasn't been active in many years. And there are also questions about what to do with water filters after when it's time to change out those filters, and concerns that communities close to incinerators might be disproportionately exposed to PFAS. Much of the water treatment right now is activated carbon treatment, and the way to regenerate those filters is with an incinerator, but there's concerns that the incineration may not fully break down the PFAS, and it could lead to contamination in local communities. So I wanted to wrap up here with some ideas for things that all of us can do. For those of us who are trying to avoid products with PFAS, it's not always easy to know what has PFAS. If you can, but here are some tips. So selecting textiles that don't have stain resistance, if you can avoid them. Avoiding microwave popcorn, eating more fresh foods to avoid food packaging. Again, maybe with the new FDA announcement, food packaging is becoming less of an important source to PFAS. And if your water has PFAS, to consider filtering it. And I think like a guiding principle I try to use is to ask myself, like, do I really need this product, or do I really need this feature? Actually, we recently bought a new couch, and I really tried hard to make sure I was buying something that didn't have PFAS or flame retardants. And sometimes PFAS offer a nice feature. It's nice to think about our couches being easier to clean, but you have to ask yourself, is it really worth the potential toxicity from increasing your exposures to these chemicals? And I also suggest that people start with a change that they're easily able to make, because there are many different ways to reduce our exposure to toxic chemicals. And it's most important to just take a first step with something that's doable for you. If you want to know if your water has PFAS, you can call your water supply to ask for results of recent testing. You can go online to look for the consumer confidence reports, which are the EPA mandated reports that water supplies are required to produce each year. For those of you who like to do a deep dive on data, there's a data portal here in Massachusetts where you can download an Excel spreadsheet with the results of recent PFAS testing. And the Environmental Working Group has a tap water database, which is a really great way to find out not just about PFAS, but other contaminants in your water. I would note that the PFAS data on that website are several years old. So if you want the most recent results, better to go to your water supply. Here in Massachusetts, if you have a private well and you want to get it tested for PFAS, there are several state certified laboratories, and you can go online on the Mass DEP website to find out which labs are certified by the state for PFAS testing in water. In general, for reducing your exposure to toxic chemicals, you can download the Detox Me smartphone app developed by our team here at Silent Spring. For PFAS specific knowledge, please check out our PFAS Reach PFAS Exchange website. The STEEP website also has resources for reducing exposures. And then just some other ways to get involved. A lot of the action and change that's occurred on PFAS has come through retailers who've been listening to their customers saying we don't want PFAS in products. And so letting retailers know you want safer products is a way to elevate your voice. Vote, support candidates who support stricter chemical safety testing, share what you learn from webinars such as this. Another way that we can amplify our impact is to think about procurement policies. So if you have any say over the what your workplace or your school or your town purchases, that's a way where you can really amplify your buying power. And some states, some institutions have put in place policies to say, like, we're not going to buy products that contain PFAS. And find out about local organizations and legislation that's being considered in your state. For those of you in Massachusetts, definitely stay in touch with Mass Breast Cancer Coalition. They've been very active on the legislation that's being considered here in Massachusetts. So there's a link to their website. Also, Clean Water Action as well has been doing a great job on the promoting PFAS legislation here in Massachusetts. At the national level, my go-to place is Safer States. They do a great job of tracking adopted and policies that are being considered in states across the country. And here are some additional resources for those of you who want to learn more about PFAS. Thanks again to MBCC for hosting me. Thanks to my kids for being an inspiration for me every day. And thanks to all of you for attending.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schaider. That was a very enlightening discussion. Really appreciate your insight. I'd like to open it up here for questions from the audience, if any have come in. But before we take a look at that, I do have one question. You mentioned about the EPA new guidelines for Massachusetts that were released earlier. How about other countries, and where are they on the research timeline, and how much of a problem is it overseas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the United States has actually been kind of in the lead in terms of setting these low parts per trillion drinking water standards, but there are efforts in other countries to address PFAS as well. So for instance, Canada is considering a limit of, I think it's 30 parts per trillion for 18 different PFAS chemicals. So kind of going beyond just that group of 6. In Europe, they're also they're developing methods and exploring using extractable organofluorine as a measure of total PFAS in the water. So when we're thinking just about PFAS, PFOA, that's really could be a drop in the bucket compared to all the PFAS that are present in water. And I think at the same time that we're tackling and really trying to understand these chemicals one at a time, we know we can't just deal with them one at a time. And so thinking about other analytical methods that encompass the whole suite of PFAS will be important.
Great, thank you. I see one comment here. Thanks, Dr. Laurel, with a bunch of exclamation points. I share the enthusiasm there. Shane, do we have any other questions that have come in? I'm not seeing any on my desktop. If we don't,
not yet.
Okay. We still have a few more minutes. Dr. Schaider has shared her email address and resources to find out more if somebody has a question after we hang up today. So on behalf of myself, the MBCC board, and Cheryl Osimo, the Executive Director of the Mass Breast Cancer Coalition, I want to thank Dr. Schaider for this very informative discussion today. And I want to thank all of our many listeners out there for joining us. For those interested, the recording of this webinar will be made available later today on the MBCC website at mbcc.org. If you would like further information to support our mission of preventing environmental causes of breast cancer, please consider making a donation by visiting mbcc.org/donate. I appreciate your consideration. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.